Okay, bottom line, what has changed? The models seem to be narrowing down on a landfall between the Bolivar Peninsula in Texas and Cameron Parish in Louisiana. This is consistent with the forecast error cone that we'll take a look at that. Not much change in track and intensity for this forecast as compared to the previous. And Laura is still likely to make landfall as a major hurricane Wednesday night along the upper Texas or southwest Louisiana coast. Here's a look at Laura, the latest satellite image. You can see Laura is looking better and better. Has intensified just a bit from the last advisory there over the open waters of the Gulf, and expected to continue to intensify. Forecast now to be a Category 3 at landfall, a major hurricane. As I said, most of the guidance and that forecast cone takes it in somewhere either side of that Texas-Louisiana border, say about 40 miles on either side. And near and to the right of where that storm comes in, we're looking at life-threatening storm surge flooding and also very dangerous life-threatening winds near that center especially. So very serious situation with this storm. Still some uncertainty in the track, but definitely narrowing down between, say, Bolivar over to the Cameron Parish in Louisiana. Here's a look at that track. You see as we get closer and closer, that cone does narrow, indicating less uncertainty on average in the track. So you can see how that cone really is sort of bisected by the Texas-Louisiana border there. And as you know, it's going to make a big difference for our area, whether it takes a left side cone track or maybe a right side cone track. We'll have impacts either way. But if we get a left side cone track, we're looking at very, very serious life-threatening type impacts as far as surge and winds. So it's definitely small changes in the track can mean big differences in the impacts that we see. Right now, forecast to make landfall as a Category 3. That's 115 mile per hour sustained, wind gusts to 140 in the forecast. So very high winds. It's been a long time since we have had a Category 3 or higher landfall in our area. We'd have to go back to Alicia for that. And it is possible, as I said, it could still take a right side track into Louisiana. So it's kind of boiling down to that. Small errors, but still will make a big difference depending on where it goes. Here's a look at the latest wind-related watches and warnings. And you can see on the western fringe, we've got a tropical storm warning, and over our eastern counties, a hurricane warning. And that makes sense, as you know, based on the track that we're looking at. The higher wind probabilities are going to be over the eastern counties, like Galveston, Southeast Harris, Chambers, Liberty, on up to Polk County, all in the hurricane warning. And then, of course, those extend farther east across southeast Texas over into Louisiana. And then there is a tropical storm warning on the western fringe that includes city of Houston, most of Harris, Brazoria, Wharton County, all the way up to Houston County. Notice how far inland those warnings extend. As we talked about earlier today, there is a significant wind threat. Whenever you have a high category fast-moving storm, that wind damage can extend far inland because the storm doesn't have a whole lot of time to decay when you have fast movement like that. So we would expect to see pretty big wind impacts near that center track, wherever it ends up being, far inland. Here's a look at our surge-related warnings, coastal flood-related warnings. Storm surge warning, you can see there basically from Sargent up the coast and around Galveston Bay. This is where there's a danger of life-threatening surge or flooding in that storm surge warned area. And then on the western fringe, we actually have a coastal flood advisory where we expect some coastal flooding as well, just not quite to the level that would make it life-threatening. So areas like Surfside and around Matagorda Bay could see some high water as well. Flash flood watch, there has been one issued, but not over our area, and I'll show you why in a moment. There will be some pretty heavy rains along and to the right of the track, and so if it were to track more westerly, then some of that flash flood risk would get into our area as well. But not the primary threats with this storm, we think, are going to be damaging wind and storm surge, depending on the track. What I'm showing here are basically relative threats for the different hazards we get with tropical cyclones. And this is assuming a kind of a direct hit on our area, a kind of a left side cone track. If we were to get that, we'd be looking at least a high threat from wind and surge. You could argue an extreme threat really for either of those, depending on how the storm comes in. Rainfall from flash flooding and river flooding, that'll depend also on the track. It's kind of a moderate threat, a slight to moderate threat. Tornadoes, those tend to be more common on the right-hand side of the track, and for most of the scenarios will be near or left of the track. So tornadoes are less of an impact, but the marine hazards will be there too with the surf, the heavy surf generated by the storm. Let's take a look at the probability of 58 mile per hour winds. And as Lance pointed out last night, we tend to get power outages when we reach these levels. Notice those high values for 58 mile per hour sustained winds. And of course, that would mean higher gusts from that. So we've got 70+% right along that Beaumont, Port Arthur area, up along the state line there, and extending well inland, 60% or higher. Again, that reflects the idea of a wind threat extending well inland. And then those values are still significant as we go on either side of that axis. What about the hurricane wind speed probabilities? Again, not surprising given where that track cone is. The highest values are, again, right along that Beaumont, Port Arthur area, extending up the Sabine along the state line there. But even hurricane force winds, you can see from this graphic, fairly high probabilities well inland. So if it comes in as a Category 3, it's going to take a little while to decay back to below hurricane strength. And since it's quickly moving, those high winds can extend far inland. Wind timing, this is the probability of tropical storm force winds and when they are expected to arrive, still looking at Wednesday evening. So that's been pretty consistent the last several days as far as sort of setting our H hour, the time of arrival of tropical storm force winds, being at the coast along about 8 p.m. Wednesday, give or take. Talking about the storm surge, we already showed you the storm surge warnings. What's the kind of general storm surge we're expecting along different parts of the coastline? And you can see it varies from 2 to 4 feet from Freeport to San Luis Pass, 3 to 5 feet from San Luis Pass to Port Bolivar, and for areas around Galveston Bay, and then 6 to 9 feet from Port Bolivar, over to Searim State Park. You can see those highest values there are over southwest Louisiana, 9 to 13 feet, then 7 to 11 feet. So all of these numbers are significant, including even a 2 to 4 foot surge or 3 to 5 feet around the bay is going to cause some high water in those coastal communities. And you can see those kind of extreme numbers as you get from Bolivar on over into Louisiana. Now keep in mind, should we get a more left side track, a more direct hit, we would expect the surge values for our area, including Bolivar and Galveston Bay, to be higher than this. So we talked about this potential storm surge inundation map, and after the recording, I'll show you a couple different ways to look at this data. This is from the 10 a.m. advisory. As we said this morning, new versions of this come out about an hour after the new advisory is issued. So you will be able to look at new versions of this. I suspect they may be similar to what we see here, but after the call, you can look for that. That'll probably be available within about 15 minutes after the call. And so what we're looking at is basically if you take Laura and run some sort of hypothetical tracks that are similar to Laura, maybe vary a few things like the speed, the direction, and the size of the storm, you can come up with kind of a risk map for this particular storm. So what does it tell you? It tells you we've got some areas there in out near High Island and then up into Chambers County of greater than 9 feet above ground level. That's what the reds are showing here. And those really high levels extend as you go farther east, as you might expect. We'll zero in on some of these areas shortly so we can get a better look at them. What about Texas City? Well, that's a leveed area, so there is no guidance for storm surge depth in the leveed areas. Even up around the upper reaches here of Trinity, you can see some flooding. Zooming in here on the left-hand side, we've got Chambers and Bolivar. Look at all those areas greater than 6 feet above ground level. That's 6 to 9 feet above ground level. So that certainly is life-threatening type storm surge. And then, as I said, the reds here, greater than 9 feet. Of course, you can see High Island poking through here, the higher elevation terrain there. So really dangerous, potentially dangerous surge flooding. The reason this is called a reasonable worst case is what they do is they take all those scenarios, and this is a level at which 10% are worse than this, and 90% are not quite as high. So it gives you, as I said, a reasonable worst case of how high the surge could be using that technique. Focusing on Galveston Island, looks like we've got some 3 to 6 foot values there, especially Bayside on the lower parts of the island, not surprisingly. And then less surge as you get up closer to the seawall there in the city of Galveston. So, you know, this can change run to run, and it's important to check it as new values come in. And then even down across Brazoria County, Surfside, I see some yellows in here. That's 3 to 6 feet, and even the blues 1 to 3 feet. So there is some high water even on the left side of the track. Rainfall, I showed you the flash flood watches earlier that were sort of just east of our area, and you can see why here. That swath of heavy rain is going to tend to follow the track and a little bit to the right. And the way it's forecast now, that tends to pile up that rain just east of our area. But again, shift that a little bit, and then flash flooding becomes more of a concern for us. This is just the same type of depiction trying to show flash flood risk, and you can see how it matches up with the heavier rain being sort of along the Sabine River there, and then maybe extending a little bit into our area, Galveston, Harris County. But again, that's going to be dependent on where that heavier rain associated, where the storm tracks essentially. So just finishing up, as we said this morning, still a threat for life-threatening storm surge. There will be certainly a life-threatening surge near and to the right of the storm's track, where that ends up being. But even left of the track, we will have some significant storm surge. And then the winds as well, especially near that center, near the eye of the storm, that tends to contain the highest winds in the hurricane. The absolute highest are on the right-hand side of the eye wall. So again, that kind of alludes to how the track is going to be very important for this hurricane as far as our impacts go. We've looked at the hurricane, tropical storm, and storm surge warnings to kind of show you where the greatest risk is for the different hazards. In this case, our far western zones are least impacted the way it looks, being farthest from the track. So So for those counties in our far western areas, probably won't see a big impact from this hurricane. What's the worst case? Of course, a direct hit from this major hurricane would mean potentially catastrophic winds and surge near that center. So that's still our biggest concern. Confidence has increased a little bit that we will have a major hurricane track nearby, either right into our area or perhaps close to the Texas-Louisiana border, perhaps even across the border. So there's still uncertainty to that extent. The forecast cone is always a good guide to use for center track uncertainty, and that's true in this case. We don't want to focus on the center line when dealing with the threats here. There may be some slight adjustments in the track even still over the next day or so, and then we have that landfall tomorrow night. So we're not far away now from this hurricane. We will be doing another webinar at 10:30, and at this point, I'm going